Hi, I'm Mike Cashion, a lawyer with Cashion Legal. We are an employment and litigation law firm in Calgary, Alberta. If you have heard of the concept of constructive dismissal and you find yourself in a challenging situation in the workplace and you're wondering whether or not you've been constructively dismissed, in this video, I'm going to run through some of the basic concepts of constructive dismissal. And by the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of this concept and a better understanding of whether you're in a situation where you should be seeking legal advice. Constructive dismissal is a legal concept that refers to any situation where an employer breaches an employment agreement with an employee such that the employee is entitled to resign from their employment and treat their employment as having been dismissed. The practical implication of that situation is the employer is then required to provide the employee with severance that they would normally receive in connection with termination of employment. Sometimes people confuse the concepts of constructive dismissal and wrongful dismissal. Wrongful dismissal very simply refers to the situation where your employment is terminated by your employer and they haven't provided you with sufficient notice or pay in lieu of notice, so they're required to provide you with additional compensation. Constructive dismissal, quite differently, refers to a situation where the employer hasn't expressly told you that they're terminating your employment, but they've done something that entitles you to treat your employment as having been terminated. There are some situations where constructive dismissal is relatively easy to prove. And it's important that I say relatively easy to prove because constructive dismissal is never a slam dunk situation. There's always complicating factors. There are certain things which are very commonly considered to be acts of constructive dismissal. For example, a salary reduction or a significant demotion. Most lawyers would agree that in many circumstances, those are acts of constructive dismissal. Conversely, there are some things which are less clearly considered acts of constructive dismissal. So some change in your working arrangement, like the change in your reporting structure, or potentially even a toxic workplace environment. Those things may not always be an act of constructive dismissal because the legal test for constructive dismissal is whether or not the objective reasonable person views the breach by the employer as sufficient to communicate to the employee that the employer no longer intends to be bound by the employment agreement. Because of that objective test, some of those more gray areas, subjective areas, it's a little bit more challenging to prove constructive dismissal. If an employer makes unilateral changes to your working conditions that you disagree with, it's important to communicate your objection to those changes as quickly as possible and in writing to ensure that there is a clear record of your disagreement. If you do not, the law may view you as having consented to those changes, which would take away your right to pursue a claim for constructive dismissal. An act of constructive dismissal doesn't necessarily mean that pursuing a constructive dismissal claim is the best thing for you to do, and there are various reasons for that. If your employer has committed a breach of your employment agreement that gives rise to the right of constructive dismissal, the next thing for you to do if the employer refuses to address the situation is for you to resign and then pursue a claim against your employer for constructive dismissal. And when that occurs, you will need to justify your case to your employer in order to obtain compensation. For that reason, constructive dismissal is a very risky proposition for most employees, and we generally only recommend that people pursue this remedy in the clearest of circumstances. If you don't get adequate legal advice and you resign without a valid claim for constructive dismissal, you may find yourself out of work and with no claim for additional compensation. If you're concerned about the way you're treated in the workplace and you're wondering whether or not you've been constructively dismissed, contact us today to book a consultation.